Hello and welcome everyone to another Sales Hacker webinar. You can see everyone just joining us now. So thank you, as always, for hanging out with us for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. Excited for this one. We got a lot of sales leadership, a lot of enablement, sales enablement folks on the call with us today. We've got a great topic, some great speakers lined up. And before I do introduce my amazing panelists, for everyone to come in. So if you've ever been on a Sales Hacker webinar, which hopefully you have, if not, this is your first one, welcome. But these are all recorded. So if you got to jump off, you got to close a deal, you got to go on a one-on-one with your manager, you got to lead a one-on-one, who knows what you're doing. There's a whole slew of new challenges that come with the work from home lifestyle. So if you got to go take care of something, it's okay. We'll send this out within about 24 hours. So keep an eye out for that. Number two is we always do these for the community. These are very much for the Sales Hacker community. So we have a deck and some really high quality content that we want to go through, but it's always more fun when we know who we're hanging out with. So there is a chat feature at the bottom there. Alex from the Sales Hacker team just said he's joining from Portland. What's up? So go on there, introduce your name, your title, what company you're with, and then please get involved into the conversation. So if you have relevant comments, questions throughout, please throw them in. There is a separate Q&A section for comments, for questions that I'll be manning. So get those in, and we'll kind of weave them in as we go. But I think that's all the boring stuff out of the way. So what we're talking about is how to inspire, grow, and enable your teams in a down market. Super, super important. I've been thinking a lot about how difficult it would be right now to be like starting a new team or even just keeping that motivation high. So this is what we're going to go through today. And I want to introduce my two amazing guests. I am joined by Katie Gibbons, who is the Director of Enablement over at Chorus, as well as Armand Farouk, who is the Director of SDR and SMB over at Carta. Katie, Armand, welcome to the community. How are we doing?
Killer.
Hey, Scott.
We're thrilled to be alive today, guys. Let's do it. I just got my cup of coffee from Scott Barker right here digitally, so you guys are in for a ride. Let's do it.
I love it. I love the energy. All right, so I gave super quick a background on you both, but you guys have both had incredible careers to date. So Katie, I'm going to start with you, and I always kind of frame it in an odd way. We were laughing about this before the webinar, but can you give the listeners and the attendees your quick 30-second superhero origin story? How did you become the Director of Enablement at such a cool company in Chorus AI?
Superhero, here it goes. My story starts out like any good superhero story does. I started out as an academic, nerdy glasses and all, writing 50-page papers for research articles. I was actually researching sales team motivation and training, but I realized that I wanted to actually do something about it instead of write papers and hope that someone read it, because no sales director is going to read a 40-page research paper. So I went rogue, left the academy, as they call it, and ended up going over to a company where I was a customer success manager for quite a few years for our finance and technology clients. But on the side, in my spare time, my little side gig, I was building out trainings, building out onboarding programs, and in that process was stolen by an executive at our organization to take a crash course in running our sales enablement team, and loved it, really enjoyed it, built it from the ground up, and then quickly transitioned over to Carta, where I met Armand and had the privilege of working with him for a year and a half until just recently when I moved over to Chorus to do it all over again, build the team from the ground up. I think I'm a little crazy, but that's what I love. I would say my superpowers are building enablement teams, growing revenue, and petting puppies. Definitely the top 3.
I love that. I love that. And such an interesting kind of journey, and one that you certainly don't often hear. What is the biggest difference between writing about a subject matter and implementing that subject matter at an organization? What are the main differences?
I think I could sum it up on one word, and it would be impact. I could write all day long about how sales teams are motivated and the best ways to train them. And I specifically studied door-to-door sales, and I would go out with them for months at a time and learn, but I never had to measure impact to say, if I actually did this, what would happen? Enablement, I have to show impact. Did I impact the revenue with this program? And how did I do it? By far the biggest one.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. And my man, Armand, same question. Superhero origin story. Such a cool company, Carta. How'd you get there? What was the journey thus far?
Alrighty, so the story here is I'm the world's loudest introvert you'll ever meet. I'm extremely introverted in my personal life. I really got to work this up here. So guys, help me out. I have a confidence issue here. I was a college wrestler by background. I sold insurance for 2 years, brutal business. I ran a startup for 2 years. I worked in venture capital for 2 years, and then I came to Carta. And Carta sells to venture-backed companies. It was this perfect amalgamation of all of my background. I started as an AE. I did 225% of my number in my last quarter. And they were like, what the heck is going on? Take what you're doing, multiply it across 30 SDRs. And so I overtook Carta's SDR organization, grew it from 15 to 30 SDRs, quintupled pipeline. And they said, hey, take that same thing, whatever the heck's going on over there, and then multiply it across another 20 SMB AEs. And so today I oversee 40 SDRs and SMB account executives. On the side, I get really bored. I don't watch Netflix. The reason I have this mic is not just for this webinar. I run a sales podcast where I get to meet a bunch of awesome sales leaders out there. So that's me.
I love it, man. I love it. And excited to extract some of that information that helped you blow out that number and then multiply that across the 40 reps that you have. All right, super quickly, before we dive into kind of the agenda for today, I want to do some shout outs because we got some awesome people joining us today. We have Sam Davis, shout out Sarah McHugh, Leon Bayer, Kyle Mose is the Senior Director of Biz Dev in Seattle, Max Spitalnik, Head of Sales and Sales Ops over at Butterfly.ai, Irene, Aaliyah, Sales Readiness from Chicago in the house. Amazing. All right, we got a lot of people here ready to rock with us. So let's quickly do a poll. So I always like doing the poll so we can see, some of people in chat, but some people are maybe a little more introverted, like my man Armand, and didn't go in the chat. But it's really helpful for us when we are able to kind of frame the conversation and know who we're speaking to and which level to kind of speak to. So super simple poll. What's your role? Are you BDR, SDR, account executive, frontline sales manager, sales enablement, sales ops, or sales leadership? And we'll let that rock for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All righty. Wow. I think this is some of the most sales leadership we've had on a webinar in a while. Typically it's like around like 10, 15%. We got 31% sales leadership / executive. So that's amazing. We've got 3% sales ops, 14% sales enablement, 21 sales management, 7% account executive, 17% SDR, BDR. So if we take managers and above is about 52%. So that's really, really interesting. So we'll use that and kind of use that as a proxy to what we speak to today. For those who said other, I would love to hear what other was. We've got a chief people officer in the house. That's cool. All right, let's go. So here's the agenda that we're going to have today. Why a clear career paths matter. Super, super important. How to actually build those career paths, and then ensuring SDRs develop on their path, the skills and requirements it needs to actually take it to that next level. And without further ado, I'm going to kind of shut up, fade into the background a little bit, act as the voice of the community. So keep the questions coming, of course. But Katie, why don't you kind of kick us off and start this presentation?
Thanks, Scott. So we wouldn't be in sales if we didn't answer the question for you of why should you be here today? So we want to dive a bit into the data around promotions and hiring, especially in 2020, and dive a bit more specifically into different roles and how they grow within an organization. So let's just start with the environment that we live in today. We're in 2020. I don't know if you guys caught that or if you felt it at any point in time in the last year, but it is a year. And so we wanted to just start to understand what's the general talk track then about hiring this year. So we pulled some data from Chorus and we were able to see that around the peak of shutdown, we saw a drop in hiring conversations by about 8%. But the good news is we're about up 13% since January. So people are thinking about hiring, but we are still in 2020 and there's a good chance that we may or may not be hiring, or we're thinking about other ways that we can grow our internal teams. So let's talk a bit about what it means to hire people and what it means to hire them quickly and the impact that can have on your business. Insight Squared has a really interesting study that they do where they talk a bit about this payback period when you hire a new rep. And if you can decrease the amount of time that it takes for them to hit their payback period, it's going to have a bigger impact on your business. What's really interesting is if you're in a situation where you have to hire 2 or 3 or 4 or more reps at the same time, your cash trough actually decreases in that payback period, and the time to get to your payback becomes much, much longer. And so this has a direct impact on your business. And there's some interesting statistics we're going to look at to understand how and why and some different things you can do. So really quickly, there's a bunch of different ways you can solve getting to that payback period. All the enablement people out there, we all know there's programs you can create. We want to focus on one thing today, and it's about growing the people that you have in your seat right now. So focusing on that first little blue circle that you see, the average cost to hire is anywhere between $4,000 and $15,000. Your $4,000 is your internal candidates. You get closer up to $15,000 when you get to external candidates. Now, we're going to skip this little circle in the middle because Armand and I are going to talk about this a bit more in depth. But you also see that the average ramp for an AE, and this totally depends on the company, but on average it's 4.5 months. That's your payback period that you have to hit. So let's jump to this circle in the middle because it's somewhere we're going to focus on a lot today. We want to talk a bit about the failure rate of promoted SDRs to AEs because that's a common growth path you see within an organization. And if it's an internal SDR to AE promotion, the failure rate's around 6%. If it's external, that failure rate jumps up to 42%. That's a massive increase. So
that's crazy. I got to highlight that again. Can you say that again? So internal tracks. So if you promote an internal SDR to an AE, the failure rate is only 6%, which is pretty small. And then if you get an external hire into that AE, that same AEC, the failure rate goes up to 42%?
Correct.
Wow. That's crazy.
It's huge. So
huge.
I think that's an important number, and I'm glad you drilled into it because internal SDR promotions can have a big impact on your business versus external ones. But what's really interesting is a lot of SDRs aren't staying. Armand, I think you have some really good stories around this, but we're seeing that nearly 2/3 of SDRs leave it voluntarily. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's so fascinating that when you see, naturally you're prospecting in your own environment for months and months and months. You learn the product, you learn the team, you learn how to internally and externally manage a deal. And still you have sales leaders who refuse to invest in their internal career paths. And so you see this 34% attrition rate for what's really the lifeblood of the rest of the sales org. And so a lot of people think that if you look at 2/3 of that being voluntary, okay, a lot of people think that the reason for that is just because you weren't getting promoted or you didn't have an extra spot for your SDR. And what I'm going to really push you all to stretch your thinking on is that people don't leave purely for that reason. Sometimes they do, but typically leaving due to lack of promotion is a straw man excuse for leaving due to lack of development. What happens is you get an SDR 6 months in who's been sequencing, they've been cold calling, they've been cold emailing, they've been making all these calls, and eventually they get to a point where they can hit their quota comfortably, right? And at that point they say, oh, I've got it figured out. And then what does the manager say? The manager says, oh, this guy's got it figured out. I guess that means we don't have to do as frequent one-on-ones. I guess I don't need to push them as hard. I guess this is probably the kind of person that I can quote unquote, let them do their thing. Top performers get let alone. And so they think they've got it all figured out. They stop developing. And so naturally they think they've got it all figured out. Well, shoot, why aren't I getting promoted? And people get disgruntled, they get frustrated, etc. People should be learning just as much in that 13th month as they do in that 3rd month. And that's on you guys. And so on the next slide, the reason that this is doubly important is a lot of times what people do is they have nothing better to offer their SDR than a promotion. And so what happens at the 8-month mark, they can't keep good people patient. They can't keep pushing their team. They can't drive their development. And so what do? They abate them with a promotion. And inevitably, we're going to end up right back in this situation as we look at SMB to mid-market or mid-market to enterprise. But you'll promote them in 8 months or you'll promote them in 6 months, and you haven't actually invested in getting them to the skill set that's required for an AE, which takes a while to develop that stuff. It takes weeks and months and sometimes years for some people to develop those closing skills. And what ends up happening is the failure rate of an SDR getting promoted under 10 months is 55%. 55%. Okay. From there, it jumps down to 31%. Once you get close to the industry average of about 18 months, it goes skyrocketing, or I guess plummeting down in this case. And I'm the last person to be advocating for, hey, don't promote your SDRs, because 80% of our internal movements to AE have been SDR fueled. What I'm saying is you have to build a good enough pipeline of SDRs to make sure you can feed your team, but then you've got to build a pipeline to develop the reps along the way. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a super unsatisfied team.
Ramon, quick question there. What is, when you set the expectations for a new hire that you have on your team, what are you typically telling them is a good amount of time that they can expect to be promoted if they're doing well? You say 2 years? Is it 18 months? Is it 1 year? Is it all different depending on their experience? How do you usually manage the expectations there?
Right. It's very important to be, a lot of people will just say, well, who knows what could happen? Amazing things could happen. And I'm sorry that at a very, very, very early stage startup, if you're hiring your first salesperson, that might be the talk track. I don't think most of the audience is that today. And so it's very important to set up that career path, and it's going to vary for your organization. I'll give you an example at Carta. Okay. Carta, when they go to SMB sales, they typically only need about a year of experience because they're selling really, really, really quick turn, sometimes one call close deals, transactional, right? And so the way we describe it is, hey, the industry average for time to AE tends to be about 18 months. You can do it typically in 12 to 18. Now, where you fall on that spectrum is contingent on a couple of different factors that we'll talk about later on in this presentation, one of which is performance, another of which is how capable you are of taking that next step, and a third is how strong of a leader you are for the people.
Mm-hmm. I like it. I'm going to steal one more question from the community because I think it's a great question. And Armand, I'll get your thoughts on this, and Katie, I would love yours after. This question is from Morgan Blem. Question is, how do you keep an overachieving and veteran SDR motivated and efficient while they are continuing their path to becoming an AE? So let's say, for example, you've got 6 months in, they're absolutely killing it. They seem to have everything. How do you pump the brakes on them a little bit, but while still keeping them motivated and efficient and overachieving?
I love it. And I managed Morgan. So look at this. We got the whole Carta family on the call. So Morgan, great to hear from you. So here's the mindset shift that I would push is, even when you hear things like pump the brakes, right? The mindset shift that everybody should have is you should actually be putting your foot on the accelerator, and you should be speeding up. And so my guess is, let's say the SDR is cold calling well, they're doing cold emails well, they're hitting their quota, they're overachieving their quota, right? Well, does that mean that you're ready to be an AE? Can you start taking mock disco calls with me? Can you go toe to toe in a tough negotiation where I'm being a tough prospect? Are we putting you in live action where you can go and self-source some potential prospects to take those first calls on? And that's what I'm suggesting is once they've got SDR figured out, your job as a manager is to get them doing the AE work and challenge them on the AE work while they're an SDR, so that when you do promote them, now it's like, I was already doing this job. And that failure metric that you saw earlier goes through the floor because you've already figured it out while they were an SDR.
Oh, Scott, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, Katie. Same question to you. Armand, love that line of thinking.
I won't totally spoil it because we talk about it at the end of the presentation too, but you have to create programs. If they're killing it, what are programs where we can expand their skill set? If they're the best cold caller you have, can they teach other people how to do that? Or are they keeping that as a lone wolf to themselves? If they're really, really into becoming a manager at some point and they're killing it as an SDR, let's put them in positions where they can start to hone that skill set. So similar to what Armand said, start to give them the challenges they need to build up into that next step as they're killing it as an SDR, because they have to be able to do both.
Yeah, I like that. And just a lot of comments coming through the community that I agree with. SDRs sometimes quit the manager, not companies. I would agree, that's pretty common. And Melissa says, lack of development ties directly back to the manager. Totally, you got to set your people up for success. But yeah, let's keep rolling on how to actually design career paths that let your teams pivot.
Thanks, Scott. So we'll talk about this a bit. And today we're going to focus on the STR path because there's a lot of different places your SDR can go to funnel your revenue or can fill it. There's the traditional path to AE, there's a management position, and there's other just go-to-market roles, whether that's in marketing or someplace else. I know there are other teams that you can build from that are also the lifeblood of a company. Customer support is a great one. We see them moving into customer success, to SE roles. I would love to spend a whole other webinar talking about that, but we don't have time. So we're focusing on something that Armand does very well and that I help with, the SDR path. And there's different ways you can design this, but today we want to talk about something that Armand does really well. He establishes the timeline in the hiring process, but I've also seen him establish with his teams, and he's alluded to this, what has to happen in order for you to be promoted. Armand, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and it's really, a lot of times, what's tough is one bucket gets satisfied. And for that reason, that's when you end up with frustrated team members is they feel like they've done the one thing, which is typically I'm hitting my quota, right? And when they don't get the next step forward, they feel like, oh, it's not a meritocracy or this or that. And you've got to get ahead of that and you've got to lay the ground on the front end. Most of the time, number one is going to be the leading indicator for 2 and 3, but not always. And so number one is, are you succeeding in the role today? I've had people who they're very charismatic. They can hold a sales conversation. They get discovery. They can ask the right questions early on. They get that, right? But it's like 70% one month, 102% the next month, 60% another month, and the performance is really, really rocky. That violates the first bucket. The second bucket is, can you do the job before you're in the job? And this is on the managers to bring this up early on, but when somebody's interviewing for AE, they should have already been preparing, doing mock discovery calls and mock demos 3 months prior. They should have 3 months of runway going into that second bucket. Number two is, can you hold a conversation in a mock discovery or a demo? Can you negotiate with a CFO or whoever your ICP is? And then the last one is a little bit of an intangible, and it tends to be more binary. It's a yes, no. And it's the reality is when you go into that AE role, I'm going to have to hire another SDR. And it's very possible that you're going to have to mentor that SDR at some point, or you're going to have to set the example for what SDRs want to be when they get promoted. And this is how you start to end up with cultural issues is everybody knows the lone wolf on the sales floor who sort of operates on the edge, doesn't really help people out, a little bit territorial. And if you're not helping, quote unquote, lead the people, then I'm not going to set the example that type of personality gets very far here. And so the third aspect, which is one that's typically not violated if you're hiring the right way and if you're developing the right way, The third aspect is, do you help lead the people culturally?
I love that. And another great question based on this, and Armand, I'll go back to you on this. And questions from Rob. If someone was really high in one area, but not perfect in others, would you ever think about hiring them? So let's say someone's off the charts in leadership, but maybe they're hitting 80% of their number, and maybe that middle one's not fully there yet. How do you think about that? And have you promoted people that way?
So there's a philosophy around hiring for strength instead of hiring for lack of weakness. And I am a big believer in that. So let's say, for example, someone is just destroying their SDR number and they're getting close in the disco, right? They're getting close. Then at that point, you can have reasonable expectation that they might be able to make up for their lack of closing skills with their extra prospecting. What I would suggest is there's a floor in each of those buckets. And then everything that's gravy on top of that, it's okay if it all sort of meshes out to 100%. But I think a really good example of when that wouldn't be okay is, let's say you're blowing out your number and you're a great salesperson, but you're causing cultural issues. To me, you have not met the floor in that third bucket. Like, culture is critical in every sales floor. And there have been times where we've had to part ways with somebody because they were causing huge floor issues and they were very strong performers, but they start to bring other people down with them. And if you let that get by, it starts to fester and grow on your team.
Mm-hmm. I like that idea of creating kind of floors. Katie, do you see it the same way?
I do. And I also see, coming from the enablement perspective, that it's our role as an enablement leader to partner with Armand to make sure this is happening, make sure that the SDRs have trainings, and also make sure SDRs are part of AE trainings. I think often enablement will separate them out, and then it doesn't give the SDR the chance to understand, here's what my future looks like. And then they're just thrown into an AE role, and they haven't been part of trainings. They haven't been part of understanding what the AE role is throughout their whole entire career. And you get that shock. And so 100% agree. And I also think enablement has to step up and include trainings and resources to help the manager do that.
Yeah, I like that. I have a quick other personal question. Armand, do you ever set up, call it like mentorship or a buddy system with your AEs and your BDRs to kind of connect them, maybe even before talks of a promotion were to happen, to get some of the behind the scenes out of the way?
Right. What we'll talk about later on is when somebody's getting close, usually when someone's closer to promotion, and typically at least a quarter out, you want them to start doing mock discoveries at a higher cadence than they normally would be doing. You're always going to be doing those at some sort of less frequent cadence, but eventually as you get closer to promotion, you want to pair them up with a couple of people who stylistically can push them in the right directions. A lot of times those relationships will just naturally form through SDR pods or SDR pairings with their AE. And there will be a very natural segue of who that person should work with. But at the same time, it's also important to throw a couple of different angles at your SDR, because if they're just talking to who they're comfortable with, they're very likely going to develop some gaps based on their areas of comfort.
Yeah, I like it. And one more question before we keep this rolling, because they're great questions and I love when thoughtful questions come through. This is Melissa. Do you ever let the SDR run the discos with the AE support as they get closer to that promotion as part of the promotion path? So this is before they're ever promoted. Are they running? You mentioned, be on some. Are they ever running it?
Yeah, I actually love it when you can get some live action going. And the way you want to do this is, if you're in a big enterprise business with named accounts, it's going to be a little bit tougher. And you're just going to have to accept that might be more of a ride along where the SDR tries to get a couple of points in as opposed to running the entire conversation. But in a world like Carta, where you have an SMB sales cycle that's early stage, you basically have them go and carve out a piece of their time to prospect some of those accounts and self-source some meetings for themselves. And so it's not eating into the inbound or anything like that. And they're actually getting in the habit of self-sourcing their own meetings, and then they take them with AEs. And if they close them, unfortunately, they don't get paid on those because they're not AEs yet. But they get the meeting and they also get phenomenal experience.
I like it. I like it.
I can
And then
hit on the
Anthony,
enterprise side. Oh, go for it.
yeah, go ahead. I was just going to underscore a point Anthony said in the comments here is a foundational step for everything we're talking about right now is laying out the expectations right from the get-go at hire, which I think is an important call out. And sorry, Katie, go ahead.
Oh no, I think that's a great point. That's something that I always respected with Armand is from the very first conversation he would have with an SDR. These are on the table as well as your time frame. And it's never a question of how am I going to get there? You know that if you aren't doing these and you're not hitting the floor of these things, you're not going to get there. And you've got to step it up. I think that's a great point to bring up.
I love it. Let's keep it rolling.
So Armand, let's talk about 2020.
Too real.
Yeah, I mean, what do we even say about this slide? It's just depressing. We need it to be over at this point. The reality is, you can do as many of those 3 bucket analyses as you want. You can do a plotting of your team in each of those different areas, and that's all fine and dandy. But the reality is, not everybody has job openings in 2020. There's not always a spot that's open. You might have somebody who's at the 17-month mark and you're not going to have a spot for 3 months. And that might mean they might have to wait the dreaded 20 months, and nobody wants to be the 20-month SDR, right? And so if you don't have those things available, if you don't have those spots immediately available, Katie, you do a lot of things on the enablement side that I've been super impressed with that we should talk about. How do you keep your team engaged if the role is not available?
Great question. I think you hit on a really important topic. The role might not be there, but there's things you can do to continue to grow and develop your team. As Armand said at the beginning, people don't leave because they didn't get a promotion. They leave because they don't feel like they're being developed anymore. And so I think there are really 2 options. The first is that you can find something for them. Armand did really, really good job of this. He'd pinpoint the strengths of the people in role, and he'd create something for them that let them grow their skill set. And then you can create programs to keep them engaged. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but Armand, I know you have some really good stories about just finding something for people, even if it's not a role, to help them feel like they're growing and developing.
Definitely. And so constantly, so the first thing is that if you've got somebody who's a strong performer who you need to keep, a lot of people say I spend less time with my top performers and I spend my time trying to bring up my bottom performers. You should be spending the most time with them. I've had somebody who was in a role for 20 months and I was meeting with him every single day and grilling him on negotiations and mock discos because the team that he was on only had to jump to enterprise AE and it was going to take him longer. And he stuck around because he felt like he was soaking in more information than anybody else, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is there are oftentimes opportunities where you're attacking a new market. You're trying to get that new partner. For Carta, there are times where there's this one industry, whether it's healthcare, life science, biotech, or various other parts of the industry that you want to go deep and wide into. Go and carve out a piece of accounts and carve out projects for your team and let people take that ownership and responsibility. And at the end, have them come back with some results and then present it to your C-suite. And hopefully you have an executive staff that's supportive of that type of stuff. But you got to find a way either through exposure or through helping the company figure out really hard problems to give your SDR some extra responsibility when you don't have the ability to do that through job title.
Totally agree. So Armand, the next thing that we're going to do, just to let everyone know, is Armand's going to dive a bit into, as a sales leader, what's a good development path that he can create to help keep someone there. And then I'll transition to how can enablement and leadership partner together to create programs that will help people learn and grow, even when promotion isn't an option. So Armand, pass it to you first. How do you build these cadences professional development with your teams today?
Absolutely. And I see a great question from Tim that we can answer in a second, Scott, which is what are some specific questions SDRs should ask about training during the first week? So why don't we talk about this cadence and then we can answer that question afterwards. Okay. And so think about things in a month, week, day type of basis. Let's start with weekly. Okay. On the weekly, it's so important in sales development. In enterprise sales, you've got quarterly, that's long-term vision. You've got annual quotas. Sales development is operational. There needs to be a weekly cadence. And so on the weekly, we do cold call reviews and email reviews, and they alternate weekly. They're Wednesdays, 8 a.m. Then we also do tape teardowns. And so when you talk about getting your SDRs ready for AE, you're tearing down chorus tapes. We're a chorus customer. You're tearing down chorus tapes and analyzing those deals. And you're pausing every 5 minutes to say, okay, this customer said this. What's the next question you're going to ask them? And you're putting your team on the spot, and you're doing this in small groups. And then once they're getting ready to get closer to AE, you're having them do mock disco calls with other AEs, like we talked about earlier. On the monthly, then you're going to step in yourself. So you can't do mock discos with every single rep every single day, right? That's a little bit unrealistic. But you can certainly, with your reps who are getting prepared, right? You can do a monthly mock disco with sales leadership, and that can be your quote unquote monthly test. And so they're doing weeklies with their AEs, and then on the monthly, they're going with sales leadership, and then you'll be able to see how they grow month over month. The other thing is every month, try to get your SDR to follow a deal from cold call to close. There's so much that happens, whether it's sending out proposals, the back and forth interactions with a prospect. There are so many little things that kill an AE's process that an SDR doesn't know about. You think you just take a discovery call, you do the demo, and you negotiate it, and it's done. But there are 3,000 steps in between they got to familiarize themselves with. And then on the monthly, also, if you're not doing this as managers, do monthly sales builders, monthly trainings with your teams, and get in the cadence of holding yourself accountable and holding your team accountable to professional development. Then 3 months out from promotion, from promotion, they are doing the live, supervised, self-sourced calls that we talked about earlier, Scott. And then lastly, you're picking up that mock discovery cadence from what you were probably doing, which was around once a week with AEs. You probably want to do that closer to 2 times a week, especially if you're not getting a lot of those at-bat live customer calls.
Love that. Great way to kind of break it down into weekly, monthly, 3 months out. All right, let's tackle this question from Tim, because I really like it. It's hyper specific. I imagine Tim's probably going through this right now. Are there any specific questions? And Katie, let's start with you. If a new SDR came up to you and asked a question, and you were like, wow, that was a really thoughtful, great question, in their first week, what would that question be, or a handful?
I love this question. And I actually had someone from Armand's team, quite a few people actually, so I don't know if he trained them to do this or he was silently hazing me, but in a good way. Armand always had new people from his team that would schedule time with me on enablement, and they would sit me down and they'd say, based on what I've learned in the last couple of weeks, I think this is where I'm struggling, and I think this is where I'm really good. What other training material do you have to help me fill these gaps that I have competency-wise quickly? And it was just a level set and just a humble ask of, I need to get better, tell me how. And then it would usually lead to, okay, let's think about this. Where do you want to go in your career? And we'd always tie it to that, because some of them were like, I want to be an SDR for the next year and a half, and then I want to go into marketing. Some of them wanted to join my team on enablement. Some of them wanted to be an AE. And the competencies for each of those roles is so different that you have to start tailoring as an enablement person. And so as an SDR, I'd say be humble and go to the people who have trainings and ideas. We're more than happy to recommend books, webinars, sit down with you one-on-one and give you opportunities to learn and grow. Many of them who wanted to join something like the enablement team, I would then start to give them opportunities to teach and learn, filling that third bucket Armand had of, can you teach other people and help be a leader? So just be humble and realize what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and then we can jump in and help from a training perspective.
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. And I think what I like so much about that is they did their homework up front, right? They didn't come to you and just say, hey, I want to get better. How can I get better, right? They did some self-reflection, said, here's what I think I'm strong at. Here's what I think I'm weak at. How can you specifically help me here? And I think when you get really hyper-specific with your ask, it takes some of the burden off the person you're asking, and they can help you quicker and more effectively.
Yeah, I always try to push back on my enablement team and also my reps of, are you a problem finder or a problem solver? A lot of people will come to me with a problem. They're a problem finder that's like, this is broken. And I'm like, great. I need you to help me understand why it's broken, what your process looked like before it broke, etc. And then the burden of finding out how to fix it is on me. If you can come to me and say, I have this problem, this is why I think I have it, and I'm thinking you might be able to help me solve it, there's a lot less emotional burden on me to try and dig in and hours of figuring out why and say, great, you have a gap in prospecting and cold calling. We've got trainings, we've got resources, let's get you built up quickly. And so always, always be a problem solver, not a problem finder, guys.
Yeah. If I could underline that like 17 times, that sentence, I would. And that's going to help you, not just in your SDR career, but your AE leadership, anything, don't just point out problems, come with solutions to those problems. It will go very, very far. And you don't have to have all the answers, but it's more about trying and doing a little bit of analysis before you just present it. I love it. Armand, same question to you. What's a specific question a new SDR should ask about training during their first week?
Yeah, and I love Katie's point around getting your team to self-diagnose early is so important, because if they're not, they're just gonna, what is the death of an SDR is typically doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, having the same types of activities as the top SDR, same number of dials, same number of emails, but for whatever reason, one person has 30 meetings and another has 5. And so it's so important to self-diagnose early. I'll give you, that was my first bucket of questions. And so Katie got that one. The second bucket of questions that's so important for SDRs is every single time as an SDR, you get something that is workflow stopping. Every single time something stops your workflow, meaning you didn't know how to find an account, you didn't know what to say to an account, you didn't know what subject line to put in your email, bucket those things out into finding accounts, emailing, cold calling, and write it down. Every single time something stops your workflow, write it down. At the end of the day, bring it to your manager or to a really good SDR and just start crossing off that list. And it'll go from 20 things on the first day to 16 on the next day to 14 on the third day. And then all of a sudden you'll be adding things to that list where it's like, hey, other people are screwing this up. I actually know a faster way to do this. Become a master of the systems. That's the second bucket. The third bucket is what typically leads to feature dumping in sales development and sales overall is a lack of understanding of before state and after state. And so, for example, someone might say Carta is a cap table management software. It allows you to issue options in a couple of clicks. That's a feature dump. But if I told you beforehand, what people have to do without Carta is they have to draft paper certificates, pay their law firm $500 to send papers from one place to another, and then an employee loses it or their dog eats it, and you can do that in 3 clicks. That's very different. And so the other thing I always suggest an SDR does is say, hey, if your solution were to disappear today, what would they have to do instead? And that'll really develop an understanding of your customer.
Boom. Great questions. I particularly love the second one around systems. And anytime you're doing tasks that take you out of that flow, write that down. There's always solutions to those problems. And I think whether an SDR or anywhere in your career, you should always be looking at, your calendar and your day-to-day tasks and saying, hey, what can I automate? What can I outsource? What can I delegate to give you some of that time back to do what you're best at? I like it. All right, let's keep it rolling and now talk a little bit about kind of enablement programs for growth.
Thanks, Scott. So to wrap us up, we want to talk a bit about what enablement and sales leaders can do to pair together to build development programs that'll help your reps grow skills if the promotion isn't available. So looking at the first one, it's, do they have the ability to solve complex business problems? If you want to grow your career at a company, you have to be able to solve complex problems. So this is something that we do at Chorus that I really love. Each quarter we do a planning process, and part of that process is looking at some of the problems we're facing as a business, and from there picking one of those problems and putting an emerging leader on that. Usually it's one of our strong AEs, strong SEs, strong SDRs, and saying, this is your project and this is your problem. Here's your group of people. Now go solve it and see what solutions you can come up with. It's usually a quarter-long project. They're still doing their job, but they are suddenly learning skills on project management, skills on presenting to executives, skills on actually solving complex business problems that are going to tie to the success of the business. They don't get promoted right away because maybe that path isn't there, but they're learning how to interact with leaders, how to manage teams, and how to actually solve problems. The next is give them the business acumen and leadership training they need to grow when that path is available. Some really cool things we've done in the past at HireView was we had dinner with the board for top performers. So after a board meeting that evening, there'd be a dinner. We'd bring in 10 to 20 top performers, and it was just open to ask any questions to the board. The whole board was there. This was obviously in person, but we can all do it by Zoom. It actually might be easier and a little bit cheaper, to be totally honest. But you're seeing how a business is ran from that perspective. Another really great easy one is give them a chance to facilitate team and forecast reviews. For our all hands meeting, I make sure instead of the managers giving the forecast, the reps are giving the forecast, because they need to know how to talk about the book of business and how we're tracking towards it, because they're going to have to do it one day. And then Scott, Armand, you both hit on this, but creating mentorship programs for your emerging leaders, pairing them with people that are going to help them grow. And one of my favorites, number 4, is actually inviting team members to leadership QBRs. Everywhere I've been, you usually have some type of a leadership meeting. And it's closed doors. You've got your director of enablement, you have all of your directors of sales, you have your CRO, and that's all that's in the room. Invite a top performer. We had a CRO who did this really well, and any emerging leaders who are looking for a management role, every quarter we'd invite a different one. They'd understand how a QBR was ran, they got to listen to it, they got to see what was happening, and they got to start to determine the strategy for the revenue business. And then finally, give them the opportunity to teach others and to learn. And so give them teaching opportunities. Armand did this well. Put strong performers in a way where they can show what they've done and how it's worked well to other people. Another great way to do this is building out some sort of an enablement facilitator program. So enablement, you shouldn't always be the only one on the call teaching. Get really good reps to be your facilitators. Let them do onboarding trainings, etc. You train them and you certify them so that they have the skills to, 1, do a good presentation, read the room, but also just train other reps and let them learn and grow. Your goal is just to help build their business acumen and let them know we care about you and we want you to be really good at your job, whether it's here or somewhere else, when a promotion is available. All right.
I think there's one super important point there that, especially in the middle bucket and in the first bucket, is people tend to leave people, and they also tend to stay for people. I think someone in the chat mentioned it earlier, is people tend to leave managers. That's one of the most true things ever. There have been times where I haven't been perfectly happy at a company in one place or another, but I've stuck around because I felt like my manager and my team were my family. And when you give people that interaction with the board, if you've got a high profile investor on your board and they get that 20-minute interaction, there's a sense of goodwill that's built with your team, and it's you investing in them. And there's a degree of natural reciprocity that your team will have back to you, because they're like, I'm not going to leave. You can always get 5 more grand. You can always get 10 more grand. You can even get 20 grand sometimes. But it doesn't always make sense, especially when you have some goodwill and relationships and people that care about you. And so the TLDR is invest in your people, and that tends to do pretty well, and it'll come back to you.
Amen. Great points. And Katie, I also love this idea of don't feel like, as enablement folks, don't feel like you have to do all of the teaching. I love the idea of empowering. You almost come up with the curriculum with the help of the sales team and sales leaders, and then get them to teach it back to their peers. I think that's awesome. All right. I think we are about to jump into Q&A after a few kind of key takeaways we want to leave you with.
All right. So I'm a big fan of 30 Minutes to President's Club. If you're not, you should be. But they do a really good job of wrapping up their podcast. And since we're lucky enough to have Armand here, he's going to wrap up our webinar the same way.
All right, everybody. So your top 3 takeaways from this webinar include, number 1, you got to focus on retaining your people before you go outside. It's really, really expensive to go outside. It's also very likely that your internal team is going to have a higher success rate. Number 2, you got to have some sort of criteria for SDR promotion. And Anthony mentioned this earlier. You got to put it in front of the team at the beginning. and it's got to be out there in front of everybody during the hiring process, during onboarding, and frequently that, hey, we have nothing to hide. Here's the board. This is the criteria to get promoted, and this is how you do it. And then number 3, if you don't have a path to promotion today, if you're in a tough industry that's been hit by COVID and you can't promote people today, go and do something else. Either put them in a vertical specific role, let them test drive a new product and try to test it in front of customers, have them run trainings with Katie's team or whatever that might be, give them some responsibility and accountability, and they'll feel like they're a part of the organization. Those are your top 3.
I love it. Amazing. And then make sure you subscribe to the weekly briefing. It's a really, really cool, interesting thing that Course has been doing. I've checked it out. It's really cool. It'll basically give you the latest data that will inform your H2 sales strategy. Of course, check out my man Armand's podcast, 30 Minutes to President's Club. I'm a little bit offended I haven't been on it yet, but that's another topic for another day.
We'll get you.
I know, Scott. I know.
Right? Jeez. And then, of course, follow Katie on LinkedIn and Armand. They're linked in there. They're always sharing great content. And we have a couple moments, so I'm not going to let them off the hook. We have some great questions. I'm going to try and sneak in 2. We'll kind of do a bit rapid fire. Last point I want to touch before we answer your questions is do check out the Sales Hacker new community layer we have. So we actually just created a peer-to-peer community. Think of it like Reddit for sales, which is really, really cool. So you can go and get all of your questions answered. I know there was like a ton on this webinar. So if we don't get to all of them, you can actually go ask them directly on their community. All right, let's dive into it. Leon has a great, it's kind of a statement, but I'm going to try and read their mind a little bit of what they're getting at. And Leon says, I have high scores in my last 9 years in sales on meeting quotas, margins, profit, marketing, bringing new accounts, sales closing, and trainings to customers and presentations. But on the other hand, traditionally been low on forecasting. What should Leon do? Reading between the lines, like how do you present that to your manager or your enablement team so you can get some training, up level your skills without maybe like highlighting one of your weak points too much? And Katie, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I'll take the really nerdy enablement side. Armand probably has more of a tactical sales manager direct answer to this, but if I think about from an enablement perspective, and I have a rep who's doing a really amazing job in quite a few of those areas, but struggling in one, if I'm in enablement, I should know that, and I should be recommending already. But if you're in a smaller startup or you don't have an enablement team yet, I would go to either your manager or someone in charge and say, hey, forecasting is something that I think I could get better at. What resources do you have? If you don't have an enablement team, message me on LinkedIn. I'll send you some as well. There's probably stuff I can dig up, but that's a big one, is just being transparent, like I said earlier, and being humble enough to say, I know I'm really damn good at this, but I need help here. Can you help me out? And we'll give you the resources you need to do that. The other one is don't be afraid to, Armand is really good at this, but take it into your hands to start finding different ways you can do that better. I imagine there's going to be a 30 Minutes Presence Club podcast on it. There's tons of resources, probably on Sales Hacker too, Scott, to help you get better. And so start diving into that research on your own, but also depend on your enablement and sales managers to help you. It's a bit of a tug on both sides. It's partially on you and it's partially on them.
Yeah, I like that. Kind of go do the research. If you're not getting enabled, go do the research on your own and then tag in with your leadership enablement. Be like, hey, here's what I found. Is that how we see forecasting as well? Is that going to be helpful? Armand, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think there are 2 pieces of this. The first piece is, how do I get better at X? And then the second piece is, how do I actually communicate that to my manager without looking like I don't know what I'm doing? Mm-hmm. And I get this all the time because I'm a director of sales now. But the reality is, like, I'm younger and I get that, and I haven't seen everything. Right. And there are times where I'm like, shoot, I'm in my role and I don't want to bring this up, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. And let's talk about the second one first on how I communicate this to my manager. Okay. What I find is really helpful is to use the same approach you use in sales, which is called 8-miling, when you have a competitor or when you have a tough objection. And what that means is you're going to get those objections out first. This is from Kevin Dorsey at Patient Pop. I didn't make this. Okay. You're going to get those objections out first. And so by coming out with the truth and leading with, hey, I'm struggling with something and you're really good at this, right? And this is something that I think I can work on a little bit. That immediately puts the guard down of the manager, and it gets them a little bit buttered up because everybody likes to think that they're good at something and they can give you advice. The other day I had to deliver some tough news to my team. I'm like, honestly, like I feel like I'm not the best at these conversations. You just do such a good job of this. As I message this tough news, like, how would you go about it? Right. And he was like, all hands all over. He was like, let me help you. And he didn't even think about like, oh, this guy doesn't know how to handle this. Right. On the piece of how to actually get better at this stuff, the reality is you're not always going to find those resources inside of your sales organization. And that's part of the reason I started the podcast in the first place is the first thing you need to do is go try to talk to somebody who knows how to do it inside of your org. And if nobody knows how to do it inside of your org, go do the research on the front end on all the problems you have, and then send them to the most respected sales leaders you know in your network, or reach out to people cold and get their takes and bring it into your organization. And that's what I typically find makes a difference between a phenomenal sales leader and an okay one, is they're able to stretch their own knowledge outside of their org and bring stuff back. And that's how you become scalable.
I like that. Great advice. And shout out Kevin Dorsey. I love the 8-miling. We all know that famous scene in 8 Mile where Eminem starts making fun of himself. That's an awesome way to frame it up. All right. Last question I'm going to steal. And this is a good one to finish up with. This is from our man, Tim again. Tim, thank you for the great questions. Tim wants to know, are there any good books for new SDRs to read to build their business acumen? I could list off 147, but Katie, let's go. What are your favorite books to recommend to SDRs?
I'm stealing one of Armand's because we would send this to our SDRs before they started. Fanatical Prospecting is a phenomenal one. I
Jeb
also
Blunt,
recommend, Oh, sorry, what was that, Scott?
From Jeb Blunt. That's a
Yes.
good one. Yeah.
And this is probably counterintuitive to what sales managers would say, but if you have a sales methodology like Challenger or Sandler, and you know that going in, or you're even asking that going in, read about it. Every single one of them has a book, and while there's probably trainings internally, that book is going to give you more information about that methodology and how to run a really good sales cycle from beginning to end. And the beginning part as an SDR is going to help you a ton, but it's also going to prepare you for that progression into an AE role if you understand the methodology well and how it works. And so that would be a big one. I also have 1,000 just really good life ones, and I could go on forever, but Armand has met me talking about books, and I want to give him time because I know we're running close. So Armand, all you.
You hit the one I was going to recommend. So upon hiring SDRs, I send them 2 books. I think of sales training in general in terms of 3 big buckets. There's sales training, there's product training, and then there's industry training. Product training, you're going to learn on the job or when we actually go through enablement. But for industry training, we send every new SDR Venture Deals, which is a book on the venture capital space. And then for sales training, we send them Fanatical Prospecting. And it starts them on the right foot up front. You're getting this theme of setting the expectations up front that you're going to own your own development. Once they get closer to AE, my favorite book to prep people to be closers is Gap Selling. It's big on understand the before state, understand the after state, stretch it out, and the money is made in the gap between the before and the after.
I like that. Gap Selling by Keenan could not, it's an amazing book. And I really like that point that I don't think enough teams do of sending a book that is industry specific. You know, you got to go deep in your skills, but also the industry. And I think that's awesome. And I think I'm going to steal that one. I like it. Well, Katie, Armand, this was a lot of fun. We'll have to have you both back. You're both an absolute wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much. And for all those who joined us today, thank you so much. You guys always bring such thoughtful questions. It's always a lot of fun. So thank you all. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you again soon.